Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today in this module we'll do Women and Labour Laws, the first part of it, looking at the historicity of conception of labour laws as part of the course on gender and social work. I am Dr. Shuli Kumar, Associate Professor, School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. The major topics that will be discussed in this module will be the historic evolution of labour laws in India and the continuum of the same in contemporary context. Also the relationship between labour laws, employment, condition of work and coverage of these laws. We will also look at the emergence of trade unions in India and the framework of labour laws after independence. Finally, we will summarize the entire module. Let's look at the inception of labour laws in India. Labour law essentially refers to laws dealing with employment relations, dispute resolution, conditions of work, wages and social security. These are some of the key components of labour laws, essentially to ensure that maximum worker satisfaction and worker needs both are taken care of. Political and economic structure of the time and the compulsions that lead to the passing of the laws at this juncture are very, very important. Most of the laws that were framed at a particular point of time in history had their own shape and form, and many of them were essentially looking at addressing the needs of the industry and the industrialization process in India. So the historicity of the labour laws essentially were located in a particular context, and the context was essentially the colonial history of India. So that's where labour laws were actually conceptualized, and as we moved towards independence, the shape and form of these laws started changing. The first laws relating to labour law were not intended to protect workers. Therefore, since it was a colonial construct and the idea of having labour laws was essentially to govern and regulate the workers the way they worked and maximize their labour. So the British colonialists essentially were looking for ensuring that there are adequate profits being generated for the industries in their own country. So it was nothing to do with protection of workers or control of number of hours that they worked or even the wage levels, but essentially were instruments of coercion and control. So let's look at the colonial history. Where labour laws first began to be conceptualized. Industries set up to cater to the Britain's international trade commitments were the core objective, and therefore rather than focus on internal demands of what is happening in the economy of India, the major focus was what is happening in the economy of Britain and the internal demands that were being generated from within that country. So the requirements of Britain in terms of minerals, mines and even some of the raw products like cotton and indigo were the ones which were focused on and were mainly extractive in nature and confined largely in small enclaves within India. So wherever Britain the Britishers felt that there was a possibility of say growing indigo, they took the farms in their own control and employed labour to grow indigo. Similarly with cotton and similarly with different mines and minerals. Unions were of course banned, and the whole idea of collectivization of labour was just an idea which the workers may have had but was not really a reality. Over 40% of the first technically the wage labour that was employed in plantations like tea and coffee, and they were largely, the 40% comprised of largely women, and there were no labour legislations governing the lives of these women. So protection for women or ensuring adequate working hours or even addressing the specific needs of women in terms of reproductive health were not something that was really covered within any labour law. The main provisions of the acts that were essentially enacted at this point were empowered to arrest laborers if they absconded from work and tried to run away, and they could be imprisoned if they refused to work. So again, most of these acts were trying to control worker so that maximum work was extracted for them, and it was almost like bonded labor. The other focus of industrial development undertaken by British Raj was mining. So one was the plantation labor, the other was the coal mines which were required for the railways which were developed by the British people. Railways were essentially developed so that major inroads could be made within the country to access those areas which are fertile with minerals. And essentially at that point of time, the railways required coal to run the engines. In the mines too, it was women and children who accounted for almost 30% of the labor. It's interesting to see that the most vulnerable and marginalized in the population, within the population of India, were the ones who were the most exploited during the British period. So this 30% of the labor were largely women and children who were forced into the mines and made to work without any regulated hours of work. Up to 1920s, family labor was also encouraged. So the entire family was supposed to be working within the mines, and they would work underground, and the work was divided in gender lines. So the men would cut the coal while women and children loaded it onto the tubs from transporting it out. Why one is bringing out this whole dimension of work is to say that gender division of labor was actually defining the ways in which women's work were also being allocated. So cutting the coal was understood to be easier for men because it was supposed to, the men were supposed to be physically stronger than women, while women were actually loading it into the tubs, which was equally hard but not recognized as such. So division of labor began even there within the coal mines, and accordingly wages were also paid. So men and children, women and children got paid less and men got paid more. A series of acts were passed, but none contained provisions which would regulate the labor of women and children. There were no statutory limitations of the daily hours of work and no exclusion from underground work. This is a significant point because largely nowadays women and children are not supposed to be working in the underground parts of the mines. But earlier there was no such restriction, and because of family labor, women and children were also part of working in the mines in the underground structures. When coal cutting machinery was introduced, and this is the interesting part, when coal cutting machinery was introduced, men were taken into consideration because it was understood that men were better in operating machines. They were smarter. They would be able to do it better. And women's labor was there was a reduction in women's labor, and there was also a banning of employment of women underground in 1990. However, when there was when World War II happened, it produced an acute shortage of labor in the mines because many of the men were enlisted in the army, including Indian men. And so the British government rode over that crisis by lifting the ban and encouraging women to participate in the mine work. Once the war was over, the ban was reimposed, and again the women were back into the underground work. So how women's labor was seen as flexibilization, flexible labor, and the reserve army of labor was a context which Marx has also explained in his treatise, to say that women were considered to come in when men moved out and went to do other kinds of work. So many ways the underclass of the Indian society was created in this fashion. In the second half of 19th century, cotton mills were also set up in western India around Bombay and Kanpur, and women formed anywhere between 5 to 20% of this workforce. So industrialization in Britain brought in Britain into India for extractive work and ensuring resources and minerals for their own factories. and in that way they also perpetuated a kind of exploitative labor workforce, labor relations within the country. So we see a lot of women working both in mines and also in factories of like cotton mills. The first labor law which was really enacted were when the British mill owners in Britain raised a hue and cry over the excessive exploitation of Indian workers and clamored for labor regulation to stop these inhuman practices in India. So somewhere there was a cohesive class that was created among the so-called proletariat in Britain and in India, and when the British mill owners understood the inhuman practices that were being implicated in India, they started raising their voice and they said that the exploitation must stop. When these voices came together, they were joined together by genuine philanthropists from England as well as from India, because at this point the Indian society had started critiquing the presence of Britain in India. And many of the philanthropists like Annie Besant and all played a big role in ensuring that some form of regulatory as well as protective labor should be passed. So the first Factories Act was regulated in 1881. This act prohibited the employment of children in factories below the age of 7 years and child labor between 7 to 12 years. And they were not, the children who were older were not permitted to work in these areas. Maximum they were allowed to work was 9 hours a day. With the continuation of the work in the mills and the factories and the coal mines, the first idea of collectivization began to emerge in India and in Indian politics. In 1890, the first trade union in India was founded. It was understood by the workers through the information that was generated that it's important to come together and demand for their rights, demand for protection, and demand for better wages and social security. So one of the Indian members of the last factory commission, Narayan Meghaji Lokhande, was an active member of Mahatma Phule's Satya Shodhak Samaj, a pioneer in education and reform in India. He took up the cause of the mill workers of Bombay and founded the Bombay Mill Hands Association. Lokhande drew up a charter of demands for the mill workers, and thousands of workers signed this particular charter. This was the first beginning of a possible trade union of mill workers in Bombay. The second labor law emerged out of this process was that once the workers mobilized together, they pressed for their demands. They they said that they would not work if certain provisions are not made. The British government had to set up the second factory commission, and Lokhande deposed before that. As a consequence, the second Factories Act was passed in 1891, which among other provisions stipulated 11-hour day for women workers. So for women, this was the first step of their recognition, one as women workers and second as some form of regulation and some form of controlling the working hours. The provisions of these acts and the restriction of working hours for women workers was, however, violated with impunity. So even though you had the act in place, most of the employers continued to violate these laws because they wanted to ensure that maximum profit could be generated and more work should be done by the workers. So whenever women did not come for work, or they would cut the wages as hours of work started decreasing. Women started not coming beyond 11 hours a day, and when that happened, employers resorted to cutting down wages and ensuring that the workers would still continue to work beyond that stipulated 11 hours a day. Some of the women's concerns that came in the forefront during this period were a consensus in government and philanthropic circles that women needed specific protection, and as a result, the Factories Act of 1911 was conceptualized and implemented, and it banned night work for women, laying down that no woman were to be employed between 7 p.m. and 5 a.m. except in cotton ginning and pressing mills, which were largely seasonal factories. Further from that, the Factories Act of 1922 shortened the woman's work day to 10 hours. This new law was again openly flouted, and Factories Act in 1934 introduced the 9-hour workday. And most importantly, the provision of creches by the employer in establishments where a sizable number of women were employed was a path-breaking move to this new Factories Act. So somewhere gradually women's specific needs were getting recognized. Some of the trade unions, there was a gradual movement and development of newer trade unions. It was realized the power of collectivizing, coming together was a realization that became very strong among the workers, and different spaces within the country started developing new trade unions so that women could demand for their rights and women could also negotiate better wages from the employer. The Madras Labour Union was formed in 1918 in Madras by a philanthropist called B.P. Vidya, who was a close associate of Dr. Annie Besant, and he was very much influenced by the earlier processes that happened in Bombay. A few months later, Gandhiji also formed another union of the mill workers of Ahmedabad called the Mazdoor Mahajan or Ahmedabad Textile Labour Union. With many more unions being formed, it was also realized that they were creating a great deal of confusion as far as decision making was concerned, and also undercutting each other's possibilities of ensuring negotiation with the employers for any kind of better condition of work for the workers. So hence the All India Trade Union Congress was formed in 1920 as a coordinating organization between all these unions. And Lala Lajpat Rai was elected its president, while Lokmanya Tilak and Annie Besant were its vice president. So in this manner, trade unions also started playing a very vociferous and vocal role in wanting adequate provisioning in different labor laws for women and other workers. The trade union movement got split on political lines gradually as we became independent and now most political parties have formed their own trade unions with INTAK, that is the Congress, Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, which is by the BJP, earlier it was Jan Sangh. Then you have the Hind Mazdoor Sabha and Hind Mazdoor Kisan Panchayat, which is set up by Socialist Party. Center of Trade Unions C2 CPIM, and AITUC remains with the CPI even till date. The Trade Unions Act was also enacted in 1926, which provided for the registration of unions with the government but not for any legal protection for unionists. So the Trade Unions Act was also essentially a regulatory body so that unions could operate in a particular manner which was considered to be appropriate by the British government. Registration of unions, submission of their constitution, audited accounts were some of the things that were made obligatory within the Act. By now there was no muzzling of the workers, and there were newer demands that were continuously made by the workers. This is also as a result of the colonial government's enactment of the clause 81A of Defence of India rules, which banned strike and made arbitration by the government compulsory in all labour disputes. So if government was going to be a stakeholder in all arbitration, the interests of the employers would be taken into account more than the interests of the workers, especially if it is a colonial government. Due to inflationary conditions caused by hoarding and black marketing by traders during this period and post this period, a lot of workers' real wages fell, and that was causing a great deal of hardship for the workers. In contrast, the profits of the capitalists rose, and they even doubled and trebled. In such a situation, the workers came together and started demanding something called the dearness allowance, which continues even today, which was a concept developed by the workers, which stood for a separate component created in the wage to be added to the wages to compensate for the fall in the real wages caused by rise in the cost of the living index. So they brought in this new concept to ensure that every time the prices fell and inflation increased, the wages would also increase in a particular manner to ensure that the workers don't suffer any hardship. because of the fluctuating prices. AITUC agitated for these demands continuously after the war, and they said that DA must be made permanent feature, a minimum wage must be made compulsory for all workers, the working day should be only 8 hours, and there should be health insurance and old age pension for all workers. These were some of the very path-breaking positions that AITUC took at that point of time, and they continue to inform labor laws today in the current context. After independence in 1947, as the ideas of social justice and welfare state became enshrined in the Constitution of India, they also became guiding principles for the formulation of labor regulations. So we had the fundamental rights which laid down certain key parameters which would govern the formulation of different labor legislations within the country. Some of the special articles that we must make a mention out here are the right to equality before law and equal protection before laws. This is very important article, Article 14, and we need to understand that how this could inform regulation of the work that women do. One, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, caste, sex or birthplace. So everybody is equal when it comes to accessing work in any form, which would mean that women cannot be discriminated too, and the state will take cognizance of this, and any woman who is denied work on the basis of her sex or gender, she can always go to court for a redressal of this particular denial. So somewhere the notion of social justice and gender equality got propagated in terms of work arena. No citizen shall on all grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, descent, place of birth, residence or any of them be ineligible for or discriminated against in respect of any employment or office. This particular Article 16 brings in the fact that even if a person is working in any remote corner of the is available for work in a remote corner of the country, even that person has a right to work, and work needs to be provided for by the state. So no person or no woman can be denied the right to work in any context based on any kind of discrimination. The Right to Freedom Act, freedom is also Article 19 ensures that workers can come together as a collective because it guarantees freedom of speech. What is important here to remember that freedom of speech ensures that women can come together, ask for certain regulatory mechanisms and ask for certain benefits which are connected with their own specific needs. So somebody with disability can ask for possible ways in which he or she gets protected and gets special provisions to address that disability. The right to assemble freely is another right that is enshrined in the fundamental rights, and they really need to be understood when we are conceptualizing any kind of laws which would protect the workers and their dignity as well as the specific needs that they may have. The right to practice any profession, so or carry out any trade or occupation. So even if I may not be employed in an organized sector, I have the right to work as a vegetable vendor, or I can start an enterprise of my own, and within the fundamental rights this is something that is already seen as justiciable in the court of law. Prohibition of trafficking of human beings is that needs to be understood, that which is very all pervasive today, but it's enshrined in the fundamental rights that women cannot be brought from one part of the country to work in a different part of the country in either bondage or in any form of exploitative system. So this particular fundamental right is critical for us to ensure and examine how laws are being formulated and actually being practiced within the country. Similarly, children cannot be employed in hazardous industries, and there is a list of hazardous industries that gets listed in every state policy, and within those kind of industries and factories, children cannot be employed. There is a prohibition to that. Besides that, the directive principle of state policy which are essentially guiding principles. They cannot be brought into the court, they are not justiciable, but what we say is the value orientation and the principles have to be followed when it comes to formulating any new law which can empower the workers, and it is to be followed by the state. It enjoins it upon the state that the state should ensure justice to all its citizens. And so within this, Article 32 talks about how workers' rights can be enshrined within different formulations of the law. So while we have inequalities in our country, and gender justice in its de jure fashion is available, that is, it's written out in the laws, it's written out in the constitution, but de facto we still continue to have a long way to go in terms of recognizing women's rights from a point of view of a human rights principle. So we need to therefore examine what exactly happens when it comes to implementation of these laws. Let's summarize this particular module. This module brings out the historic journey of labor laws in India. So it brings in how the colonial history of India impacts the ways in which labor laws were formulated at a particular point of time, and then it continues to be informing the formulation of new laws within the country. It emphasizes essentially that during the colonial laws, the focus was on exploitation of natural resources as well as of labor, and labor just not of men but also women and children. But as time passed, trade unions and collectivization of workers brought about a lot of change in the labor laws that were enacted post independence. Key of these is the constitutional framework, which we need to keep as a guiding principle, and the norms of social justice that should regulate the lives of workers, and specifically women workers, when we are formulating or looking at implementation of laws. However, though there are a lot of protective and promotive laws available for guiding women's work, women workers' rights still remain in the periphery, and most laws that were enacted at that point of time are largely gender neutral, and at that point, that is after independence. So the women's movement continued to interrogate and question as to where are the laws which should be addressing women's specific needs, and also promotive in terms of women workers being able to work effectively in all kinds of workplaces and all kind of work situations. So that is something that the women's movement continued to engage with post independence. Thank you.